Good evening, gentlemen. Um, Coming at you live from the office of the commissioner. A big day in fantasy ball's history. What the? These are not my slippers under the desk. Um, Big day in fantasy ball's history today. Um, and I know some may say that's excessive, but it is. This was a big one. This was a big one, and I decided that it deserved a full breakdown of today. So for those of you, I mean, if you don't pay attention to the group chat, you're probably not watching this anyway. But did Boba Fett get all of that? He got all. Oh, he got all of that. That's Goner. That's up 4-0. So, as we saw in the group chat today, Jake announced his trap of attempting to keep Malik Nabers. I use that word very intentional right now, before I give the answer to the deliberation. I don't want to, try and imply one way or another. So he was attempting to keep Malik Nabers. That is factually what happened. Okay? He announced that, and it sparked some controversy. Seems like a big word, but it got some people thinking, right? It had some thoughts behind it. So before I get into all the thoughts and everything, I'm going to go over a quick timeline of what happened till we got to this point. Last year, 2025 draft, 8th overall in the first round, Malik Nabers drafted by myself. Okay? September 28th, tears his ACL. Okay. On October 15th, just over 2 weeks later, I dropped him. On October 29th, exactly 2 weeks later, Jake picked him up. And today, August 21st, Jake announced that Malik Nabers would be his keeper. Now, I've spoken to 6 people that are not in the fantasy football league. 3 of them have been, or 2 of them have been, and 1 of them has been in our baseball league. 3 of them are completely unrelated, have nothing to do with our fantasy league whatsoever. I did reach out to 2 other fantasy baseball players that are actively in our league. Did not hear back. I got a text back, but did not respond to the voicemail question posed in their voicemail. And the other is on a hiking trail right now. So probably not going to hear from them for a while. Quick tally of the people who spoke today in the group chat. And of the 6 I spoke to about this, 4.5 and a half, and I'll explain what I mean by that, said yes, Jake should be eligible to keep Malik Nabers as a 10th round pick. 7.5 and a half said no, he should not be able to keep Malik Nabers as a 10th round pick. I say 0.5 and a half because Alec answered both as his legal brain and as a member of the league. He said as a member of the league, he doesn't think it should happen. In fairness, he thinks it should. Those of you that remember Tyler, who played with us last year, I think, Cameron's basically brother-in-law, he said that it should be allowed this time, but a rule should be established forbidding it going forward. So that was his determination. I spoke to Griffin from our fantasy baseball league. He said no. I spoke to Cameron, and he said yes. Cameron had a lot of thoughts on this. Cameron basically said the second that he was dropped, draft position does not matter. That's an oversimplification of Cameron's thoughts. But he did have a lot, including same thing in a trade. If you trade him, same thing happens. Draft position does not matter. I spoke to my cousin Jack, not the Asian one, the white Asian, the white Jack, not the Asian Jack. Currently attending Auburn University. He says no, keeper should not be allowed. That it should not be kept as a 10th round pick. I called Jamie Vardy, a good friend, Eddie's best man, John's current roommate. And I explained the situation and I explained our rules. Turned out Jamie was on speakerphone and John's other roommate, Mike Schumacher, was also in the room. Both of them contended that no, Jake should not be allowed to keep Malik Nabers. Mike had a lot of thoughts about it, including that is not the spirit of the idea of keepers. And, the spirit behind keepers is to draft well so you can keep high-value players late in the draft, not so that you can cheesy your way into a star late because of an injury. And then you all saw everything else that happened in our group chat. I think the most important point that Jake made today was that the rule does not say undrafted players are a 10th round pick if they are then free agents. It's a good argument. I think the caveat to that argument is that the rule doesn't say a drop player loses their draft. I think what is most important is that it was a first round pick, and our rule of no first or second round picks is still very important. And the reason I think this is such a big decision is that it would set a precedent in transaction rules. Not necessarily in adding and dropping players, but hypothetically, as Eddie said, say he has the number 1 pick, rage quits, drops all of his players, somebody picks up Jahmyr Gibbs as the number 1 overall pick, but then would they be eligible to keep them as a 10th rounder? Some say yes, some say no. I don't think that's what's important. I think what's important to think about is trade value. If you picked somebody in the first round and you trade them away, and you get the first round pick or the number 1 overall pick, and someone gets the 6th overall pick, and halfway through the season you guys swap picks. As the argument says, any transaction would be forfeiture of that draft position. That was Cameron's argument. That was a couple of people's argument. Once a transaction occurs, draft position is invalid. What's preventing anyone from just swapping first round picks and using them as a keeper in the 10th round? So I think that's the dangerous thing that we are playing with. So I don't want to set a precedent, but we're some cheeky fellas, so I want to acknowledge that Jake made a play here, and that's why I also pointed out the timeline. If you all remember, you probably don't, but I do. I had a lot of injury woes last year, and it is clear from my holding Malik Nabers for over 2 weeks on my roster that I was not planning to just drop him until I got hit by the injury bug and I needed space on the IL. Couldn't do it anymore. 2 weeks later, after that, Jake picked him up for a cheeky play. It was interesting. I think what comes into question is what if he dropped him again and somebody else picked it up, right? Like, there's other things that can happen. But Jake planned this out, and he did his best. So I think that should somewhat be rewarded. At the same time, I don't think Malik Nabers should be considered a 10th round pick, as he was still a first round pick. So, one thing that was already happening the last couple of days is I've been working on, as you all know, I try to do the absolute most as your fantasy commissioner. I discovered someone on the internet doing more than me. Absolutely unacceptable. And I've been making amends behind the scenes and should hopefully have an announcement here for you guys in the next couple of days for some big things coming out, including a rule book, a written out rule book. One, so I don't have to keep fucking writing it out to you guys every single year. But two, so that we can go through and have these things written down and have these kinds of arguments. Alec had an interesting point, texted me separately and said that, if we're going to have something like that, we should have a sit down with everybody on a call, Zoom, whatever it might be, and hash things out. I don't know if that's necessarily necessary. Very interesting idea, but I also think getting 10 of you or 10 of us on a Zoom call is an absolute nightmare of an attempt. I can't see that happening effectively at all. So, in the future, this kind of move is not going to last. Any person drafted in the first or second round, regardless of transaction, is going to be considered a first or second round pick. In this instant, Jake will be eligible to name Malik Nabers as a keeper. However, if he wants to use Malik as one of his keepers, he will have to forfeit his third round pick instead. I looked at some ADPs. He's getting drafted around there anyway. That is my best middle ground that I can find. Reward Jake for thinking sneakily and getting ahead while protecting the sanctity of this league, not setting a precedent that anybody can just remove their draft stock from a first or second round pick and be able to keep them as a 10th round pick. That is really the concern, right? No one's worried if someone drops a 6th round pick and somebody else picks them up later and decides to keep them. Hasn't been an issue. Nobody's cared. I think where this is coming from, obviously he's coming off an injury, but it's a borderline top 10 wide receiver when he was healthy. How does that injury impact? We don't know, but having him as a 10th round pick seems a little cheeky for someone that didn't play for Jake at all and just sat in the IL all year. So Jake is eligible to keep. Depending on league response, it could be considered that Jake would lose a 4th round pick instead of a 3rd round pick, but I'm also pretty satisfied with the 3rd because that prevents Jake from keeping him multiple years. At this point, it's kind of a gamble on Jake, right? If Malik Nabers looks good, which he hasn't been practicing in full contact, but he's looked good in training in terms of his movement. If he returns, Jake gets a great player in the 3rd round. Has a pretty good roster, assuming his first 2 rounds go well. And he has arguably probably a top 2 or 3 receiving core in our league, depending on his draft. He can do that if he so chooses. If not, Malik Nabers would not be a keeper, and things go as normal. that rule book again, ideally, if not by the end of the weekend, next weekend. I'm started coaching, so I am pretty busy now, but I think that is what makes the most sense for this league. I think it protects the league. It doesn't set a dangerous precedent that you can just swap first rounders, and then at that point we might as well just have a full keeper league, and do the taxi squad with the rookies and things like that, because you can just swap first round picks with someone early on, and so be it. I can keep them for the next 9 years essentially. So that is the ruling from the commissioner. I realize this is a 16-minute video explaining it, but I wanted to, in detail, do the best that I could. So yeah, if you watch this, thank you. I do not do this lightly, Jake, but I think it is what would keep the balance of the league best. Good luck. We'll see you guys soon.